Lacey, welcome everybody. Great to have everybody on the line today. I noticed as I was web searching today that Google has a first day of fall logo on its site. For those of you that are north and east, fall looks normal. For those of us in Southern California, fall looks like the hottest weather of the year. So forgive me if I'm a little disoriented this morning. What I thought I might do today, as Lacey said, we're sort of looking ahead to our Strategic Partnership with Impact session, where we provide tools for HR leaders to have deeper dialogues with the strategy makers and strategy formers in the organization to pull that strategy apart and then put it back together to see where are the talent pivot points, the organization pivot points, et cetera. And she also mentioned the future of HR work that I've been doing with Ian and with others. And one of the things that's coming up kind of in both topics is an increasing realization that or at least an increasing question that the answer to HR's effectiveness may actually lie in reaching out of the profession. So that's why I sort of teed up the topic of it takes a village. John Boudreau, So, Evan, I noticed that you are speaking, and we may need to mute your line.
I got it, John. Sorry about that. You should be good.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, this notion of it takes a village was kind of driven by some data that came out of a study that Ian and I did a couple of years ago, and again, is increasingly coming up as I work with CHROs and others. And we think about the role of strategic partnership. Certainly one of those roles is to more deeply know the business, is to connect HR as we know it today to business outcomes, to sort of take the things that we do well and find the places where they'll have the most pivotal impact on the organization. And we'll talk a lot about that in the seminar next month. However, there's also another sort of theme that's going on, which is the idea of not just knowing how to apply HR to the business, but also thinking about how to draw on business models from other disciplines. And increasingly, I think the idea that if we're going to accelerate strategic partnership, that may actually require now that we not only be deep in HR, but that we get deep pretty quickly on emerging trends. And often those are trends that are not part of the standard competency model for HR. And that's kind of teed up this notion of perhaps it takes a village. Perhaps it means that we need to think very carefully about the nature of our functional boundary, about the nature of what it means to be in HR and outside of HR, about how we accelerate the development of the profession, perhaps by not holding on so tightly to the idea of the profession as this sort of silo that requires that we all be certified to be inside the tent. So I'm going to touch on a little bit of data today, and hopefully we can also have some discussion today about this issue. Again, it's coming up quite a lot as we think about what the talent of HR will need to look like going forward and how we'll best get things done. I'll start with this slide that Ian and I put together based on some of the work that we did a couple of years ago. This appeared in the 2011 Org Dynamics piece, and we still use it pretty actively. It still comes up a lot in the work that we're doing with groups of chief HR officers and others. The idea, and I basically raise it here as an example of some trends that have begun to emerge that I think really call into question this idea about how does the HR profession, how do HR professionals approach their work. So if we look at these trends, the idea of hero leadership, meaning leadership vested in one or a group of people, the idea of leadership development as preparing people for a set of top jobs, to collective leadership, the idea that leadership can bubble up from anywhere, the idea that the leaders of the future need to be better at leading a collective of people rather than a sort of organization structure, and that their leadership will be vested in things like expertise and popularity, that sort of thing. So that kind of calls into question a lot of the ways that we might think about traditional leadership development, and it suggests that there may be other models that we might want to look at, such as network models or maybe something like supply chain or movement models. The second one, intellectual property to agile co-creativity. The idea there is moving from a world in which we say, we invent stuff we keep it secret, we put a fence around it, we make sure nobody can copy it, and we draw all the value we can from it for as long as we can, is really giving way to a world in which we are likely to have more agile co-creativity. Ideas are more open source. Ideas of today are actually obsolete much more quickly. And we need to think about the notion of rapid prototyping and co-creating very often outside of our functions, certainly, when we're creating HR processes and applications, but for organizations, co-creating across the organization and maybe even outside of it. Again, this network idea comes up. It sort of calls into question, I think, a lot of the ways that HR supports innovation and creativity. How good are we at managing a network that extends beyond our boundaries? How good are we at managing people who will never be paid by our organization, crowdsourcing, et cetera? Employment value proposition to personal value proposition, and also sameness to segmentation. Those kind of call into question the idea of, does employment really make sense now as the way to define our value proposition, or is it really much more based on the individual? To what extent do we need to segment our organization or even people outside our organization versus living by the rule that says if everybody's under the same system, then that's how we achieve fairness or equity? Again, that calls into question and draws on models that look a lot more like marketing models than they do like HR models. Fatigue to sustainability, we're all very aware of the 24/7 world, that we're all constantly connected. There's plenty of data to suggest that people, particularly in the Western world, are working much, much harder than they were before, lots of burnout, et cetera. To what extent can we create a sustainable value proposition in terms of work? And again, that starts to look at models much more like models of neuroscience, models of health and well-being, that sort of thing, than just models of traditional work and work organization. And then finally, the bottom one, persuasion to education, is really a transition from a world in which our goal as professional leaders is to persuade others to either do what we know is right for them to do so that they stay out of trouble or so that they create value, to persuade them that we're adding value, to demonstrate our ROI, that sort of thing, to a world in which perhaps education will be much more the key, the idea that we're successful when other people are smarter about this thing we call talent or human resources or organization capability, and how good are we at educating, at capturing minds, and at making other people good at this stuff, not just ourselves. Again, as I think about that, that looks kind of different from the function that we see today. The nature of strategic partnership is defined differently if we say, it's fine if we're very good at HR strategy, it's fine if we know where the pivot points are in the organization, but how good are we at getting others to understand a framework that lets them be smart about that? How well would your leaders articulate where your talent pivot points are? What's the connection between HR and organization value if I were to ask them that question? That kind of gets at the heart of that. And again, to me, it sort of leads to thinking about the HR profession, the professional boundaries, and the way we get our information and use our information very, very differently. It suggests much more than just a partnership with others where we apply HR in a way that helps them, and much more a partnership in which we expect them to engage with our discipline in a way that makes them smarter. Now, I'll sort of segue to this next slide. Again, it's something that we've talked about before. We had the opportunity to study a number of different organizations, about 11 organizations, 30 HR people in each. And just the shorthand on this is that we ask them across a number of different trends, and you can see the trends on the bottom, and I'll talk about 4 of them today, globalization, generational diversity, et cetera. The trends are organized according to the purple bars in the graph. The purple bars reflect people's response to the role that HR has now in these trends, and you can see the scale at the top. So on the right-hand side for gamification, a 1.9 means that on average people rated the role of HR as somewhere between no role and an occasional role. On the left side for globalization, on average people felt that was between 3 and a 4, active support or primary input. What's striking in this graph for us was the light blue bars, which reflect the question of what ideally should HR's role be today in applying these trends inside to the workforce, in other words, to issues inside HR. And you can see the gap between the purple and the blue. What's also striking is how high all of the blue bars are. Even if you move pretty far to the right on things that HR has relatively little role in currently, for example, with big data, you actually see that the rating of what HR thinks is ideal is very close to a leader and a key expert. I've written a bit about that over the last couple of months with the theme about is HR's reach exceeding its grasp? In other words, do we aspire to be leaders in virtually everything, even when the current status is that we're not that involved in a lot of these things? And so just to give you a sense of the 4 topics that I'm going to talk about today, what I want to do is return to you with some data about how it appears some of the more future-focused HR organizations are solving this dilemma. One way to solve the dilemma is to say, oh my goodness, we need an HR competency model. We need HR leaders that are increasingly competent in things like gamification, big data, open innovation, all those things over on the right. The trends on the left, the have-arrived ones, in many cases HR does have some competency in those, although as Ed and Sue and Chris and others have written here at the center, even on the sustainability one, HR is more frequently not at the table than at the table in terms of discussions of organizational sustainability. So there's a real question to me about how we solve that gap. Is it appropriate to say, well, as we've done in the past, we're going to trust our profession to become good at this stuff? And just as we learn to become good at a global workforce, we'll become good at gamification, and when that happens, we'll achieve our leadership role. Given the speed with which these kinds of trends are emerging, that suggests to me that it may just not be feasible, that may just not be the path we can follow now. And so therefore, it's a question of how can we engage these trends? How can we exploit the potential that these trends have for a better workplace, for a better HR profession, if we're not going to be the experts, if we're not going to have that ideal role of being a leader and a key expert right away, particularly with the things on the right. So I'm going to talk about globalization, which is the left-hand bar, generational diversity, which is the one second from the left, because those are kind of have-arrived trends. And I'm also going to talk about big data, which is second from the right, and mass customization, which is sort of on the fourth from the right. And I just want to, these are just selected trends for which I want to give you some data about how HR organizations may be solving their dilemma here. Let me describe the trends, and then I'm going to stop for a moment. I'll just give you fair warning. And I'd like to get some initial reactions to how is it that we're going to solve this dilemma? How are some of you solving this dilemma? The dilemma being that we have trends that are emerging very quickly. For many of them, the HR profession, HR professionals today are, involved at a level that is, let's say, 3 or less. And yet, for almost all of them, the average rating from HR leaders, the same ones that said they're not that involved, is saying we need to have much, much greater expertise. So I want you to think about that. Is that a dilemma for you? Is that something that you face? How does your organization deal with it? So the trends then, just to quickly describe them that I'll be talking about in a moment, will be globalization, pretty straightforward definition. I'm not going to read this slide to you, but the idea of global markets in every area, certainly global labor markets, and the notion of whether HR's traditional toolkit is enough to deal with the increasing globalization and dispersion of work around the world. Generational diversity, the idea of having 3, maybe 4, maybe 5, maybe even 6 different generations now in the workplace, and to what extent does that call a challenge to the standard diversity models that we have? What does generational diversity look like? How do we manage it? Everything from knowledge transfer to different values to different world perceptions, different uses of technology, et cetera. The next one is big data. And we've heard that term bandied around a lot, the idea that increasingly we are confronted with data that's too big, too unstructured, or too diverse to be stored, analyzed, and by conventional means. The notion that you have people clicking on your HR websites every day, generating tons and tons of information. I just did a blog about predicting predicting your workforce without freaking them out. that noted that it's possible now probably to predict which people in your workforce are going to leave before they even know that they're thinking about leaving, to predict which parts of your workforce are engaging in unhealthy practices and suggest to them perhaps ways that they could be more healthy. Where is the dividing line on that is one of these questions. And where would we go to learn that? Who are the experts on that? And then finally, mass customization, the idea of putting the benefits of mass production together with the benefits of customization. For HR professionals, that basically has to do with finding the balance between the fact that we could customize the workforce deal for almost everyone, whether it's through giving them tons of choices in terms of how they're paid, what benefits they engage in, when they take time off, et cetera. Should we be customizing to the point of an individual deal for everybody, individualizing work, as Ed calls it? Should we be keeping hold of our traditional values of having everybody on the same system so that we're sure the system operates fairly? Or is there something in between? And that's the promise of mass customization, is finding that balance of something in between that is the right balance between segmentation and, a personal value proposition for everyone and putting everybody on the same system. So I'm going to, with those defined, now you can kind of see where I'm going. What I want to do is go back to this graph before that I think sort of captures the dilemma. And I'm going to stop for a moment and see if any of you have some comments about this dilemma. Are you seeing the emergence of these trends? Are you trying to tackle them perhaps by becoming expert yourselves, or is your HR organization trying to become expert? Are you managing to catch up to the demands for leadership that we see here versus where HR is involved? Or are you finding other ways to sort of deal with this dilemma? Any thoughts?
So we have one hand up, first initial D, last name Thurman.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a line associated, so I'm just unmuting all the caller lines until hopefully we get to that person.
Okay.
So if you are the person with your hand up, go ahead and chat with us. I think I've probably got you unmuted.
So D,
it's D. I actually don't have any questions.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure why my hand is up. Sorry.
Just a random hand. Okay. Any of the others of you, if you see that raise hand button on the bottom right of your screen, that's the way you let Carrie know that you might be interested in making a comment. I think, as Lacey said, you can also type them in. I don't know if we see any typed comments for now. So any thoughts on this? Is it a dilemma at all? Do you find that, are you, would you say, we're fine. Gamification will come of its own accord. We're not very good at it as HR people, but we're not very worried about it. Big data, that's fine. We'll get there. Or are you saying, we've actually had to make some concerted efforts here? Thoughts?
So Steve has a question. Go ahead, Steve.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, John.
Yep.
The thing that I kind of realize is I think there's a lot of opportunity where we don't know what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of concern of, hey, open innovation. Yeah, HR needs to be a leader there. But we perhaps don't even fully understand what that means and what HR's true role in it is.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people just marking high because, we better go do that because that's the latest buzzword.
Yeah. Do you? Again, you don't need to so much talk about your own organization, but would you say the impression is that there's kind of an effort then among HR professionals to sort of go after open innovation themselves, to sort of learn more about it, to bring it into their professional work, to try and get ahead of that curve by becoming an open innovation group in HR?
I think open innovation was just an example, but I think there's buzzwords that will go and pick off. I think big data is a current one that a lot of people and a lot of organizations are going after. The generational diversity, I've seen a lot of people going after that, even though I've seen studies say generational diversity in the workplace doesn't matter that much, and I've seen studies that say it does matter. So I think there's a lot of information that's out there that we can after, and studies like this, I hope, spark people to go off and look at these things. I don't know that people really are stuck in the weeds doing their and not looking at the emerging things, other than people like yourself.
So that's helpful, Steve. Thank you. And I apologize. I think Steve's breaking up a little. But if I'm getting the kind of gist of what you're saying, we certainly see a lot of headlines that this is coming, that this is going to affect HR. We see a lot of headlines, many of them from organizations that some of you are in, that give us glimpses of what the future might look like. But I think, Steve, as you said, there was also quite a theme that came out of this study that we did, that HR is also kind of in the weeds a bit, that we continue to work on the traditional things that we do, that we might maybe gently touch on these things. And again, part of the pattern that I saw was HR folks looking at this and saying, I know it's coming, I know that we need to get good at it, but as you said, there isn't a lot of time in the normal day of an HR leader to sort of carve out the space to go off and figure out some of this stuff and innovate on some of this stuff. Let me see if others have a comment on that, whether a good example of how you feel like you're getting on with it, or maybe an example that would suggest where the dilemma lies for you. Any others?
Eddie has their hand up, so I'm going to unmute Eddie right now.
Hey, this is Edie Stoll.
Edie, sorry.
That's okay, no problem, at Caterpillar. The whole question about open innovation and then also the concept of process ownership, what are the implications there? We just are in this really interesting time of moving toward more the open and really collaborative work with our HR business partners across the company. I sit in a corporate role, but it's very, very interesting to see how difficult that is to make that change. There's a lot involved here with switching more from that process ownership mindset to the whole open innovation, let's work with our HR business partners even. So I wanted to toss that out there. What are the implications? What have you seen? What has worked well, maybe?
Yeah, I'll offer a view, and then if other people want to chime in, we can do that. I don't know that anyone has the answer, Edie, but I think there's a couple of patterns that seem to be happening. I know in the world of software programming, and Teresa Wellborn has written a lot about this, the idea of extreme programming, which there's a wonderful video out there that I use that shows people doing programming on laptops, jumping out of airplanes, and deep sea diving and cliff diving and that sort of thing. And that's not what extreme programming actually means, though I kind of like the metaphor. But what it really means, the reason it's called extreme, is changing programming from something that is done sort of in sequence. We do a needs analysis, we come up with a design, we perfect that design, we design the program based on that, and then we put it out into the field as a finished product. And the idea is to take that and just turn it on its head and say that we're going to do all of those steps all the time and in conjunction with our users. So basically, the sort of counterintuitive things are, we are about to put something out here that is imperfect, and we know it's imperfect. And we're putting it out here quickly before we perfect it because we want your input on it. And because we all know it's imperfect, we've designed our launch to be more about learning what the imperfections are that bother our users the most and fixing those quickly, rather than hoping that we got them right and trying to convince you that this system is what you needed. And for everything from information technology to call centers to web-based HR user experiences, even to things like, how we do performance management, how we do strategic planning, all of those things, I've seen examples in all of those areas where organizations are essentially rapid prototyping. And it really is a very different mindset. For me, the interesting issue is, we have a good deal of experience in another discipline. This discipline of programming and software design has been kind of doing this for a while. There's lots and lots of information out there, and I wonder if HR folks are aware of that. Kind of like to what Steve said earlier, whether they're reaching out to that discipline to say, well, what's the best we know about this rapid prototyping? Or instead, are HR folks sort of saying, gee, we're going to have to figure this out, maybe in danger of reinventing the wheel? So, Edie, you're still unmuted. Let me see if you have a reaction to that, to what I just said or experiences there.
Well, I will say this. We have a long way to go and a lot to learn. it is real interesting. I mean, our mindset and methodology has been for eons, very well engineering whatever it is we do, even, whether it's a tractor or whether it's an HR process. And so we are right in the middle of learning how to do this. That's really the reaction I have. And so I'm all ears, but I don't want to jeopardize the conversation this morning. But I'll just, take any ideas or cues along the way that could help us. So thanks.
Okay, well, we may come back to you. I don't know if you have an example, but that's fine. Let me see if others want to get in. Any others? Thank you very much, Edie, for helping us kind of flesh out the dilemma. And as you say, sometimes it's better to sort of look at one of these trends and say, how are we addressing this? Again, I'm calling out a little bit the distinction between feeling, the idea that the way we'll address it is we will go get good at it, versus perhaps other ways, like I think Steve was saying, maybe realizing we don't know what we don't know yet. Any others? Just stimulated any other comments, and then I'll be happy to move on, but please raise your hand. This has gotten pretty interesting with the two that we've had here.
Ellen Johnson has her hand up, but I need to find which line she is because it's not associated with her name. So I'm just unmuting all of the call-in lines. So Ellen, if you can just start chatting, and we should land on you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, John.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi. That last comment was very interesting because I thought, we've spent a lot of time in HR trying to perfect our change management skills, which is getting people through the knothole of understanding that what we're putting out there is what they need. And so it's almost as if some of the skills that we have might get in the way of our adopting some of these new mindsets.
Interesting. Maybe say just a little bit more about that, like maybe take change management. What do you mean by things the skills that we have maybe getting in the way?
Well, we're honing our skills to get people to change, to get people to adopt what we're putting out there. And if we think we're good at that, then it's kind of hard to let go and say, well, let's just put something out there and,
I see
and not, what I mean? It's a whole mindset.
Yeah, very interesting. That we'll get it all set, we'll put it out there, and then the change is defined as getting to the new thing. And I think this kind of comes, again, just to sort of continue to reference some of the things going on at the center, if I've got it right, some of the things that Ed and Chris write about with regard to agility would suggest that it's shifting that mindset to be the idea that change will be constant and that we're constantly sort of innovating, we're constantly sort of revising rather than sort of this is the new thing, now let's all get through the nut hole to get to it. The idea is maybe we're always going to be in that nut hole, moving from one thing to another. It's maybe more like a corridor or something like that. I don't know what the metaphor is. And as you say, that's a very different mindset, that we're going to admit that any current state that we have is imperfect, is changing. And I think, again, around this open innovation question, it's one of those areas where you look around, and I think you're right. You say, do the change models that we have really capture that? Or are they more about getting from point A to point B and the change process that makes that happen rather than being in a change process all the time? Very interesting point. And for me, the interesting thing would be, are there other disciplines that might have already confronted this? As I said, in the case of open innovation, one can say, well, at least looking at what's published, it looks like the world of software design kind of confronted this issue, that it isn't getting people to adopt the new system or the new software or the new application as much as it may be getting them to engage with us in constantly changing it. Really interesting issues, I think, about, what if we said things like our organization design, even something like the interface you have with the HR profession, the nature of our things like our performance management systems, our reward systems. Those things are going to now be rapid prototyping. We're going to be constantly looking for the flaws, the things that need fixing, and we're going to be pulling them back in and fixing those things as we go. It's kind of a tectonic shift when you think about it. And for me, one of the interesting things is then, where would we go to find expertise about that? Is that something we're going to have? Is it in our change models, or might we want to look elsewhere? Now I'll give one more shot at a bit more conversation if we want. Thanks to all of you for chiming in there, and then I'll move on. What I'm doing now is making sure someone hasn't been waiting to make a comment and wants to get in on this just before we move ahead. Do we have a couple of others? I think I see a couple of other hands raised.
I see that Quan Tai has her hand up. I think that she's unmuted.
Thank you. Hi, greetings from Shanghai. I'm actually very interested in what you have just said, predicting the employees going to leave without them knowing that. Because I believe being able to predict turnover will help us to take some proactive action to recover the employees. Is it possible for you to share an example or a method now, or when I'm in town for the workshop in October, John?
Oh, well, thank you, Quan Tai, and thanks for raising your hand as somebody who's coming in October. And by the way, thank you for your commitment. What is it? It's got to be, what, 12:30? Past midnight? Yeah?
Yes, it is.
Yes, thank you very much. I admire your commitment. I hope I have the same. I will, let me see if I can, I'll certainly try to answer your question, Quan Tai, and then let me see if I can relate it to today. And then, as you say, you and I may have a bit of a further conversation when you're here in October. Certainly you're right. That what I was getting at in my comment was just to kind of create a little bit of controversy. I was just actually, there's a lot of good articles coming out and about the idea that marketing is switching from a kind of advertising model to a surveillance model. I think that's the way The Economist put it in an article I was reading today. And the idea is that marketing is much more moving toward the web. It's much more moving to watching your behavior and then tailoring things to what you do. That means that the data that's being used to watch you can be used to predict what you're likely to buy, what your stage of life is, what you're interested in, et cetera. So what I was getting at with my controversial comment, Quan Tai, is you're absolutely right that using big data to better predict things like when employees are in danger of leaving or when they might benefit from something that we can offer them, that sort of thing, that has a lot of terrific benefits. How labor markets are going to evolve, et cetera. One of the cautionary things I think now is the idea that if you can predict these things, should you, basically? And I think it becomes more apparent if we were to say, suppose your big data system began to be able to predict when people are, eating bad things in the cafeteria and they're gaining weight, or, all those little Fitbit wellness contests that you're doing, you're getting data on how many steps they're taking every day. Well, it's conceivable that your system could actually put together a profile where you could say to someone, our HR system has found that you should be eating better or you should be exercising more, and we're happy to come to you and recommend that. And what I mean by that is I think at some point it starts to violate perhaps the norms of privacy that people have. And then to relate to today's topic, what's interesting as well to me is where would HR go for guidance about that? Are we going to rely on our own models, our models of reward systems, our models of legislated privacy, our models of information systems, or would we say there may be other disciplines or other professions that have already begun to deal with that, perhaps in marketing, perhaps in the legal world, et cetera? Has somebody else begun to try and solve this question of the balance between privacy and the balance between predicting and then trying to help our employees? So that's kind of what I was getting at. Is that helpful?
Yes, perfect for now. I'll talk to you more in October.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Carrie, any others?
Yeah, I have a comment on the chat box that I'm going to send to everyone right now from Suzanne.
And I don't see it, so you may want to just read it. I may have my screen set up.
Okay, sure. It is. My concern is that non-HR employees and managers might resent taking time away from their, in quotes, real jobs to help HR resolve imperfections in a premature rollout. Taken to the extreme, for every new process or program, isn't this a lot of time? I like to get a lot of input up front and yes along the way, but unless there's a significant issue, let it sit for a while, then modify for the next cycle. And then she asks for thoughts.
Yeah, who was that?
Suzanne.
Thanks, Suzanne. I mean, that's just a really terrific comment, and I don't know what the answer is. I think you've raised a beautiful example of trying to achieve a balance between the promise of some of these things, gamifying everything, rapid prototyping everything, customizing everything, and the balance we need to set between the extreme version of that and maybe something that's more appropriate. I couldn't agree with you more that if HR goes out there and says every imperfection is going to be solved and we're constantly fixing everything, it's probably a recipe for chaos. My feeling is there's probably some balance between that, and I know you're not saying this, and perhaps a model that says, because it's so much trouble, once it's out in the field, it's going to stay out in the field for a long time, which is just the way that software development used to work. So I think again, I don't have the answer to your question. I don't know that there is one particular answer, but it occurs to me that there may be people in the world of software that have wrestled with this a lot and who have experience with how you decide which things you correct first and how you set those priorities. And if they do, moving on to kind of my next topic, I wonder if we're set up to tap that and to know that. So I'm just going to move ahead on the slide deck here a little bit and remind us of a couple more trends, and then I want to show you some data. As we think about those trends I talked about, and I think also some of the controversies that each of you has raised here, these are some of the implications that Ian and I came up with about where HR needs to go. We talked about the idea, I'll start at the bottom here really, that we need to be prepared to lead transformational change. We need to break out of traditional patterns, and that the HR leader may become the hub of the voice and the discipline of transformational change. Where else is that likely to come from? Marketing, finance, operations? Probably not. So the expertise and the capability of breaking out. The idea of seeking out, finding and surfacing the unpopular truths, finding the elephants in the room, whether it be product defects that nobody's talking about or overly risky behaviors that leaders are making in terms of incentives. HR being responsible for finding those truths. Moving one up, and then the top two kind of relate to today's topic, venturing out, having influence beyond the HR function. So to the extent that HR leaders are influential in company issues, in government issues, in lobbying, in geographic issues or local community issues. To what extent do we take our disciplines of HR, things like engagement and values and reputation, and bring those to bear on constituencies that actually exist beyond our function and maybe even beyond our organization. And that relates to the top one, which is probably more relevant to what I was going to talk about today, which is this notion of reaching out. The idea of opening our profession to others. So to take the examples that you've all raised, should we have some sort of a marketing privacy expert working with us on our big data initiatives? To Quantai's point, are there people out there who've already figured out some of these privacy issues, who already have fought the battle or made the mistakes when they went overboard with looking too deeply into consumers' lives? And again, I've written a bit about that on some of the blogs at Harvard and elsewhere. You can see examples. And could we learn from that to say, how do you know when you're getting a bit deep into employees' lives and maybe going a step too far? What's the balance there? If we think about what we don't know about things like open innovation, are there right in your organization software developers or project developers that have been wrestling with the dilemmas of open innovation and rapid prototyping for a long time, that have made the mistakes that HR is going to make as we wade our way in there? And should they be a part of the HR function? Should they at least be part of our expertise set? So that's kind of the dilemma that led me to begin thinking about this idea of it takes a village. And it led me to some data that I don't think we've reported very much here at the center that I'll cover with you now, and then I'll open it up again for some questions before we conclude. So if you'll bear with me, I'll show you a graph and then show you some examples of some analysis that we did. Again, this is the same sample of about 300 HR leaders, about 30 of them in each of 11 organizations. It's the same sample. Hang on, I'm going to jump around a bit here, but I just want to give you, it's the same sample that generated this graph of the blue and the purple lines. Let me see if I can make this work here. I'll go back to that. Okay. So this was people's responses to the question of what's your involvement today, and what should your ideal involvement be? We asked a whole bunch of other questions in this survey that that had to do with the nature of the HR organization people were involved in, and also we asked a question about, do you take the lead on this issue, or do others take the lead on this issue? So basically what you see here is a set of bars that represent the results of the question asking HR leaders, does the HR function take the lead on this issue, or do others take the lead? Now what's being shown here, when the bars are negative, when they drop below the middle line, that's a negative correlation between that question, do others take the lead, or do you take the lead rather, and what I'll call the futuristic nature of HR. So basically, here's what's going on here. These are correlations. Think of an index that is whether or not you're pursuing futuristic things in HR, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. But basically, it's items like, do you have disciplines like sociology and statistics and that sort of thing? Are you a strategic business partner? The more people said yes to that, you can see on the left, the less likely they were to have others taking the lead on globalization, generational diversity, et cetera. Those bars fall below the graph. What's interesting is on the right. The more futuristic people said their HR function is on this index of futuristic, and again, I'll show you more on that in a moment, the more likely they were to say that other functions take the lead on gamification, big data, open innovation, and mass customization. In other words, the more futuristic your HR function, the more you are likely to be reaching out to others on the right-hand side of these trends, the ones that are on the horizon. On the left-hand side, the ones that have arrived, the opposite was true. The more futuristic, the more developed your HR function, the less likely you are to have others take the lead. Now that suggests to me a kind of interesting, nuanced response to this dilemma, that when things are emerging, let's say leading or futuristic HR organizations seem to be reaching out beyond their discipline, actually inviting others to be involved. As these trends become more mainstream, as HR learns more perhaps, as we look to the left, others taking the lead becomes less likely the more futuristic your function. Now I'll flesh that out for you just briefly here, and then we'll stop again for perhaps questions. Now these are a little busy slides, but I'll just give you an idea of what's going on. The main thing is to look on the right. This has to do with globalization, for example. Okay, so what we have here then is we had a question that said, do other functions take the lead on dealing with globalization as it applies to HR issues, inside HR issues? When the rows are green, it means that this was a statistically significant correlation where with the item on the left. So let's take the first one. How many years since you began your professional career? The longer someone said they had been in HR, the less likely they were to say other functions are taking the lead inside HR. And you can see how many years have you worked. Look at the third one. What % of HR time is spent on strategic business partnering? The more you said time you spend on strategic partnering, the less likely you were to have other people taking the lead on globalization. And you can see that for the most part, they're all green. To the extent to which social networks, diversity, inclusion, and globalization are a part of HR. That's in the middle part. The extent to which you use disciplines like business strategy, finance, culture, and motivation at the bottom, all negatively correlated with others taking the lead. So that's kind of predictable. The more advanced and developed the HR function is, the longer our tenure, the less likely we would let others take the lead on globalization. Let's look at generational diversity. Again, one of those that's arrived. Again, all on the right are green. Now, in the case of generational diversity, a little different set of items in our index of futuristic HR came up, and you can see those items on the left. But as you can see, we have kind of a similar pattern. If leadership is seen as a collective capability, if HR uses data analytics, to just take a couple on the left, we see that that's negatively correlated with other disciplines taking the lead on generational diversity. Now, let me show you the one that was kind of surprising to me as we move to the right. So now we move to big data. And I've colored in yellow the items that are positively related to letting others take the lead. And as you can see, virtually every item here is positive now in terms of others taking the lead on big data. If we have rotation of HR into other disciplines, if we have HR varying to fit the needs of different units, if we have disciplines like political science, risk optimization, et cetera, being used in HR, all those futuristic indicators are positively associated with others taking the lead on big data. And then finally, a similar pattern for mass customization. The degree to which HR is characterized by sustainability, by individualization, by rotating people into HR from other disciplines, by being active in driving sustainability. All of these things are, again, the ones that were statistically significant as indicators of futuristic HR. And as you can see, almost all of them relate positively to letting others take the lead. So for mass customization, lots of yellow. Others take the lead. For, and I'm just going to cycle back here, for big data, lots of yellow. Others take the lead. Generational diversity, lots of green. More futuristic, then HR takes the lead, and the same thing with globalization. And I'll come back to this graph here just to sort of summarize what we saw for all of these trends. Again, in the middle, you get kind of, in the middle few, you get somewhat not strong relationships, but the left 2 bars and the right-hand 4 bars really show this difference. Futuristic HR organizations seem to be choosing their spots. They seem to be reaching out on some of these bigger issues, and the more futuristic they are, the more they're delving into new disciplines, the more they're rotating people from other disciplines inside, the more of a strategic partner they are, the more that seems to hold up this relationship. We reach inside for the ones that have arrived. We reach outside for the ones that are on the horizon. And that kind of then brings me back to, and I'll just use this as, let me just see what I have here, as a concluding slide, this notion of the way HR leaders are going to function. And I'll leave this up here just as a beginning for our discussion. I'd be curious about your reactions to this. Does this suggest that the HR organizations that are most advanced are going to be making very specific choices about where they choose to try to build it within the profession, and when they step back and they say, let's let others in here. Let's let others take the lead in helping us apply these trends inside HR to our own issues. So what do you think about that? Examples? Any controversies? Any pushback? Should HR be reaching out more? And should it be better at deciding where it reaches out and where it keeps things inside? I'll just keep talking till someone talks, but that notion of it takes a village. Do you think of yourself as surrounded by lots of people in your organization, or maybe even outside, who have expertise that you need? How often do you go to lunch with your marketing folks to talk about privacy issues as they use surveillance, so to speak, on their customers? How often do you go to lunch with your software developers and product designers to talk to them about rapid prototyping, to talk to them about the principles they use to know when to correct and when not to correct? To what extent are you going to lunch with the people in marketing or operations that are dealing with big data in their own disciplines and trying to figure out how they might help you with the big data dilemmas that you have? Thoughts on that?
So the hands that I see up are Steve and Edie, so I'm not sure if these are new responses that they want to make, or, okay, I'm thinking no because Steve's just went down.
Okay.
Edie, did you have a comment? Oh, no, hers just went down as well.
Okay, so if you want to click on that hand at the bottom, if you've got any further comments here about these data that I've shown, or I'd love your questions about the data, or maybe if you feel like they may not be showing the true picture, and also, of course, any of your experiences about where you are reaching out, perhaps, and where that's really been helpful to you to accelerate your or your function's development, or maybe you want to push back and say, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to be bringing too many of these disciplines in. It makes it look like perhaps anybody can do HR. Do I see Misha down there at the bottom?
Yes. There's also a question in the chat box from Paul.
Okay, well, since Misha's got her hand up, Misha, why don't we have you speak, and then we'll do the chat box question, too.
I guess I want to share experience when I did go outside of HR. It was a critical project that we had to do for HR, and we had very limited time. And I happened to have a conversation with the head of marketing on another subject, and Stacy and I wound up talking about what was going on in her part of the world, and I realized, like, oh my gosh, I'm missing a whole element that I didn't even consider in terms of major campaigns. And because of that, I took the time to not only spend time with her, but the engineering team, the project teams, et cetera, and we were able to not only accelerate our plans in terms of rolling out the project, which affected the majority of our employee population, but we were also able to do it under budget and in less time. And it was all because spending time, which was, purposefully going in, having a conversation, 45 minutes, with them, and they wound up engaging and offering information that I didn't even think about.
Interesting. Yeah, really interesting application, Misha. Thank you. Did you find any interesting things there that I'm hearing? One was it wasn't a massive initiative. It was, I think you said it was 45-minute conversations, that kind of thing. Is that right?
Correct.
So informal, not necessarily super formal. And then I'm wondering, did you experience resistance or surprise from these folks in asking them to work on an HR thing?
They were surprised, and they engaged immediately.
Nice, interesting. Yeah, I hear that a lot, actually. I mean, some of you have heard this. One of my favorite examples, I was privileged enough to be asked to write a case study about IBM taking the supply chain idea to their talent movement systems. And they did that by reaching out to their second-in-command supply chain officer, Harold Blake, and saying, basically, we know you don't know anything about HR, but you're an expert on supply chain. We want you to come develop our system. And to Misha's point, I heard the same thing from him when I interviewed him. When they sent him the email, he thought it was a mistake, and he sent it back and said, you must have meant this for someone in HR, because I don't know anything about talent management systems. And they were smart enough to say, no, that's not the point. We'll help you with the talent management part. We'd like you to engage with us on an interesting project from a supply chain standpoint, which is how people move around here. So kind of like what you were saying, Misha, I think there may be perhaps even more willingness and more enthusiasm in these other disciplines than we might think. Thank you. So, Carrie, you said we had a chat box question. I want to be sure and get to that one before we finish.
Yeah, the chat box question is from Paul, and it is, I'm also starting to see a trend, particularly in smaller companies, that turn high-performing, totally engaged HR business partners into resources that have been adopted as part of the business with great HR acumen. They become as an integral member as a team that focuses on competencies than the functions/professions they formerly belonged to.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so that idea of sort of moving, I hadn't thought about that, but I think what we're hearing here is moving HR people out into these other functions, perhaps to apply their HR expertise on things like teaming or something like that to these other functions. One of the things that it shows up in the survey that Ed and I do, it's a separate set of data, but the survey that Ed and I do of the progress of HR is that we see a little bit more rotation of HR people out to other disciplines as part of their career path. We're still kind of waiting to see much movement on the rotation of other folks into HR, which is a bit of kind of what we're talking about here. But I hadn't really thought about that. It could work both ways, with HR bringing some real needed expertise to other disciplines that have dilemmas around the things that we know. So with that, I know we're about 3 minutes before the top of the hour now, and I appreciate all of you joining us today and staying with us for the and for particularly all of you that have been. Let me just see. Jill, did you have your hand up? I'll take one more. I don't want to overlook that.
Yeah, I'm working on unmuting Jill right now. It's one of those lines I have to find.
It's unmuted to me. Jill, let me just see. Or maybe you can unmute all of them, Carrie, I think.
Yeah.
Jill, did you? I see your hand up here. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just was reinforcing some of the things that you were talking about on, reaching out. And I've really, over the last year or so, started doing that, reaching out to the operations leaders, to the finance leaders, to the BD leaders to really see what is going on. And it has helped us shape our talent strategy. It's helped me know the business a heck of a lot more, especially, and this just helps me be a better partner and be more at the table. And so I'm using a lot of big data now with them to say, hey, this is what your organization looks like. This is your potential. This is what you said. Where do you need to be? And it helps you, I think, understand how you can make a difference. And I think that's the differentiator, like you said. If we sit in HR and not get outside of that, we're not going to be as valuable and as valued.
Well, thank you, Jill. That's good. And not a bad segue to, I'll remind everyone about the October session. And Jill, I think that, what you've described, the idea of sort of reaching out, sitting down with those other folks you want to partner with, really deeply understanding what's going on in their organization, I would call it finding the pivot points that are going to make the big difference for them, and then helping them connect that back to the stuff that you do, where talent and organization and capability can make a difference in what you're going to do about it. Let me just say, with a bit of an advertisement now, for those of you joining us in October, or those of you that will join us, that October session is very much about a set of tools that can be the content of those discussions. And Jill, I know you're doing a terrific job with that. What we find from people who've graduated from the seminar is they say, I came away with a set of questions, a set of tools with kind of a content structure that I could use to engage those conversations. And one of the things that we'll encourage and think about in October is to give people a chance to sit back and think, how can I put this into action immediately? Who could I go talk to? Where could I have this conversation? Where is the place where I can learn more about, where I can make the biggest difference with what I do through our people? And with that, I see we have reached the top of the hour. Thanks again to all of you. Lacey and or Carrie, I'll let you bring this to a close today, and I'll look forward to seeing those of you who join us in October, and of course, seeing you in all the other center activities and events that we have coming.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on today's call. If you have additional questions or would like to learn more about the session coming up in October, please don't hesitate to reach out. As a reminder, you will be receiving today's deck and recording within the next few days via a link in an email from me, Lacey. And again, John, thank you so much for your time and the great dialogue of today's call. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.